Hello, I'm Natalie Walker from the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm the Senior Manager for our work on tropical forests and agriculture. In today's chapter, I'm going to be discussing supply chain solutions to deforestation. In recent years, many major international corporations have adopted zero deforestation policies, and they've often done this in groups, such as in 2014, the New York Declaration on Forests, which companies like McDonald's and Kellogg's announced that they wanted to work towards a zero deforestation goal. But we've been interested to understand, can these international corporations' efforts actually make a difference on the ground? Can they really stop deforestation? And what are the challenges to doing this? For several years, we've been teaming up with academics, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Brazilian research institution Amazon, and many others, to use the latest satellite technology and great efforts towards transparency to understand the actual patterns and changes that happen after companies adopt zero deforestation policies. There's a growing awareness that the major drivers of tropical deforestation are increasingly commodity-oriented crops like palm oil, soy, and they're increasingly export-oriented, or even within countries such as Brazil, major companies selling the goods are international companies. For example, Walmart is a major supermarket in Brazil. And so we wanted to look down at what was going on and also understand especially how NGO reports, which have highlighted the negative impacts of deforestation, not just on the ecosystem services of forests, but impacts on climate, biodiversity, communities whose livelihoods depend on forests, are affected by these international supply chains. If we take a look at deforestation patterns in Brazil, there was a huge increase in deforestation until sort of the mid-2000s. And there was an international response, and the Brazilian government and many other measures took effect to lead to a dramatic reduction in deforestation by about 80%. But at the same time, if you look at the blue line, you can see that this is cattle in the Amazon, and almost a third of Brazil's cattle herd, almost 60 million cows, are actually in the forest biome, the Amazon biome of Brazil. But the numbers actually greatly increased without deforestation. And this is because there's been a focus on improving pasture management. So you don't need to clear more forests to have more cows. You can just manage your land better. And also, the model of sort of clearing more forests for more land for agriculture is harmful both to producers as well as to the climate. So a lot of people, when you talk about cattle and climate change, you think of methane. Well, that's an important source of emissions. But if you have deforestation, it really swamps the emissions from methane. So if you look at sort of this chart, you can see basically if you have deforestation driving beef, you increase the emissions by 25 times. So that's accounting for all the methane. If you're going to choose between being concerned about cattle emissions, it's really deforestation, which is the most important one. And again, it's a loss for productivity. So forests have a really important role, both in the local rainfall and climate regulation in the Amazon, but also in the south of Brazil. It's about half of the rainfall in the south comes from the Amazon. And so if you clear the Amazon, not only do you have less productive land there, but the really fertile soils in the south of Brazil, which is so important and highly productive, are going to be very negatively impacted. And they've already seen this. There have been droughts, historic droughts in the south of Brazil in recent years. And not only that, the Amazon also helps source rainfall for our global patterns. And so there's many reasons why if we really want to be concerned about long-term sustainable food supply chains, especially if you're an international company, you need to be concerned about the Amazon. The Amazon forest serves an important role not only for rainfall and productivity of agriculture in the Amazon, but also outside it. Firstly, in southern Brazil, if you look at this chart, about half of the rainfall in the very fertile and productive lands in the south of Brazil comes from the Amazon. And Amazon deforestation can lead to severe droughts and negative impacts on productivity in these southern lands. And also internationally, the Amazon plays a key role in global weather patterns. And it's been estimated that if we lost major parts of the Brazilian Amazon, you could have an impact on the Sierra Nevada snowpack. And so even the Northwest US would be impacted by deforestation. We really need to tackle Amazon deforestation, not only to support long-term production in the Amazon, but especially if you're talking about the long-term goals of global food companies for their long-term benefits, both in Brazil and elsewhere. So about 80% of Brazilian beef stays in Brazil, although we think around a quarter of it is sold domestically by international companies. But for leather, around three quarters is exported. Quite often the processing happens in Asia, especially in China, for sort of mid-range goods. But in designer products are mainly produced in Italy. But your leather shoes that you buy with a big name brand in the US very may well have originated in Brazil, even if it says Italian leather. That's where it was processed, not where the cows were from. This has been recognized increasingly by international leather brands and beef brands. So what could we do about it? What was done about it? Well, this is just a map to get our bearings of the Brazilian Amazon. So the green areas are forest. The red is deforestation. And if you can see the dots there, they're the major slaughterhouses. And you can see how they're really close to sort of the edge of where deforestation happens and roads. It had been well known for many years that cattle is the largest driver of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. But especially for international NGOs, it's been a difficult issue to tackle because it was an issue of food for Brazilians and it wasn't sort of a big an obvious target for campaigns, but it had been then recognized, though, that there was increasing amounts of exports and also that the leather industry, big name brands you would have probably are wearing or own, were sourcing leather from the Brazilian Amazon. Influential reports were produced by NGOs such as Greenpeace, documenting not only the social environmental impacts of deforestation associated with the meat industry, but also they linked it all the way to big name brands, beef jerky, leather, fast food chains, to try and bring together companies to try and do something about it. And they also took advantage of the fact that there were, this is back in 2009, 4 major meat packers that were controlling a majority of the slaughter in the Amazon, around a half of the Amazon slaughter. And so you didn't have to talk to hundreds of thousands of ranchers in Brazil. You could just talk to a handful of companies. As I mentioned, this report that you can see called Slaughtering the Amazon was released in 2009. And at the same time, the federal prosecutor in the state of Pará issued $1 billion of fines to farmers and also to meat packers purchasing products stemming from illegal deforestation. And the federal prosecutor agreed to withhold those fines in return for meat packers signing what's called a Terms of Adjustment of Conduct, or a TAC. And under this agreement, companies agreed to exclude ranchers with deforestation who didn't have property registrations, who had been accused of conditions analogous to slavery among their workers, or whose land encroached upon indigenous areas or protected areas. And the companies agreed to develop monitoring systems in order to identify where their suppliers were. And at the similar time, they signed an agreement with Greenpeace, which got a lot of international attention, with very similar sort of stipulations to the agreement with the federal prosecutors. Part of this agreement included, and this is part with the federal prosecutors, that meat packers would put online their suppliers. So in Brazil, I can walk into a supermarket and buy some beef. And if you see in that label there, you get a date and a code, which is a slaughterhouse code. You can then go on a meat packer's website. So this shows you the largest meat packer in the world, JBS's website. So if I plug in that data, I can get, as you see here, a list of ranches. And not only that, there's also a link to Google Maps. So I can actually see where is that farm. And then I can use Brazil's online open access deforestation monitoring system called PRODIS. And there's a property registration system called the CAR, which has the boundaries of properties. I'm going to show what this all looks like. But we can basically overlay where the suppliers' ranches are and their deforestation to see if they're complying with the agreement, which is not to buy from any producers with deforestation after 2009. And we can do this to really understand how have the meat packers been able to implement their zero deforestation policies? And what were the ranchers' response to it? Did it really change practices on the ground? These agreements covered at the time about half of the slaughter. So this is a map to really show you what this looks like. So the light green are producers that were selling to JBS prior to their zero deforestation agreements that they no longer bought after the agreement. The dark green are the ones that they were supplying after their zero deforestation commitment. The yellow are just other ranches they don't buy from, and the red is deforestation. And what you can see is where I've circled, that's an example of a ranch which had deforestation that JBS used to buy from, but they no longer bought after their zero deforestation agreement. And if you look at the dark green, you can see there's no red overlap. So this is sort of a zoomed in area, but just to give you a sense of the detail that we were able to look at and to understand what the result was. And this is all work carried out by Holly Gibbs' lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is in the state of Pará, where before the agreement, over 30% of JBS suppliers had deforestation. And this massively dropped in 2013, even though JBS were doubling the number of transactions. So it wasn't prohibiting them from buying, but they made a major difference in who they were buying for. So it really shows that their sophisticated system for monitoring deforestation was being highly effective. But you may say, well, didn't you just tell me earlier on that there was an 80% reduction in deforestation in the Amazon during this period? So we needed to understand, well, did that go beyond that? This is the University of Wisconsin conducted a panel analysis. And so this takes into account all the different factors influencing the choice of supplier from JBS. And they want to see if you just isolate deforestation, did that make an impact on their purchasing probability? And you can see that sort of, so you want, it's hovering around the 0% sort of between 2009 and 2011 while they were ramping up their system. So what that was saying is that at that point, deforestation wasn't making a huge difference on their supply. But then you see this huge reduction in 2012 and 2013, which shows very significantly that taking everything else into account, deforestation was a major determining factor of who they bought from. So JBS were really making a difference, and they were actively avoiding producers with deforestation. But there's a little bit of wrinkle to say, well, what did this mean for deforestation? One of the sort of the limitations of the agreement is, if you look at this chart, you see slaughterhouses in the Amazon and the fattening farm. These are the ones that are monitored by these zero deforestation agreements. So it's the farm that they buy from. But actually, there's a complex system that goes on with, because cattle can move. Quite often, calves are reared on small farms that may have do other things than just cattle. And then they may sell direct to a fattening farm, or they could go to a middleman or through an auction. And so there's a large amount of the supply chain that is not being monitored. And so we wanted to see, what is that is that a constraint towards actually reducing deforestation through these agreements? And the other constraint, as I mentioned, there's only about 50% of the slaughter is party to these zero deforestation agreements. And so if I were a rancher and suddenly my supplier is telling me, you can't sell to me if you're going to clear, am I going to change my behavior, or am I going to sell to the other side, another meat packer who doesn't have such a commitment? So what we found, and this is sort of showing that example here, is if you look at the bottom two boxes, so if I'm a compliant rancher, I'm more likely to sell to what we call a G4 meat packer, because it's called the G4 agreement. But if I want to deforest, I have two options, which we've called leaking and laundering. So leaking means I can just go and sell to somebody else. There's enough meat packers out there who will buy from me with deforestation. But I can also launder, meaning I can sell or move my cattle to some other farm before I sell to a G4 meat packer. Or I may be a rancher with more than one farm, and I can do my deforestation on one farm and then move my cows to the farm with no deforestation before I sell. So because of these opportunities for leakage and laundering, we're not yet seeing a big impact actually on deforestation. But because we've demonstrated that meat packers are really making an effort, they are successfully implementing these extremely sophisticated systems with tens of thousands of suppliers, we want to look at how we can help close those loopholes. And there are two opportunities that we're working on. First of all, the federal prosecutors have now got these TAC zero deforestation commitments with tens of scores of different meat packers. So we're trying to increase the number of meat packers that are actively monitoring for deforestation to sort of stop the leakage opportunities. And there are also efforts by a number of different organizations to try and make these monitoring systems much, much cheaper so that smaller meat packers can participate. And the other thing we want to do is help go beyond the fattening farm further back in the supply chain to address what we call indirect suppliers. And so we, with partners in Brazil, have set up the Indirect Suppliers Working Group, where we bring together ranchers, the major supermarkets, the major meat packers, industry associations, research associations, a number of different civil society groups, and we also invite government to work together to look at how can we trace back beyond the fattening farm and support fully deforestation-free supply chains, which companies have agreed that's what they want to do. The agreement with Greenpeace also says that that's what they need to do, but we need to develop a mechanism to do this. There are tools already existing in Brazil. For example, to show hoof and mouth disease inoculation, there's already a system for animal health to trace all the way back through the supply chain. And there's some requirements, for example, if you want to export beef to Europe, there's a specific system. And so there are tools, and we're working together to try and implement them to really be able to capitalize on the great progress we've already seen and really make that translate into long-term support for deforestation-free beef in Brazil, because that's really a possibility. There are win-wins for everyone. And as I've shown for the climate impacts, that's really the only way to have long-term sustainable agricultural development in the Brazilian Amazon.